fisherman's eyes. More fish, more often.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Fisherman's Post Saltwater Podcast series. It's good to return after a roughly 2-year hiatus, and we have for you a treat. We have an episode titled Inlet Fishing for Spanish Mackerel. My guest is Captain Pierre Agena of Rising Sun Fishing out of the Wrightsville Beach area, and our topics tonight are going to include times and tides, what to look for, lures, and tackle choices. And then, of course, we're going to be talking about trolling versus casting. My name is Gary Hurley of Fisherman's Post, and Fisherman's Post has been serving that saltwater fishing community of North Carolina since 2003. We've been bringing you fishing reports, fishing tournaments, fishing schools, membership weekly reports, and now in our latest and greatest effort, the Saltwater Podcast series, where we reach out to our captain and guide friends from up and down the North Carolina coast, ask them to share their thoughts, their insights, their knowledge on how to catch more fish more often. And for the first time in podcast history, I am not joined by my longtime good friend, Billy Thorpe of Thorpe Creative. No, after thousands of applications, after hundreds of interviews and trial runs, we finally found the right fit. And that right fit is my new co-host, David Harden of Harden Creative Media. David, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Gary. Thanks for having me on.
Man, that was a big build-up, so don't let me down.
Well, I'll try not. But you know what won't let you down?
What's that?
Sponsors.
Never.
Because believe it or not, we have not one, but two sponsors for the podcast. Starting off with two. The first sponsor let's talk about is Port City Signs and Graphics.
Love those guys.
Their work is all over town.
All over town.
You don't even know it is. If it's a good-looking sign, chances are it was made by Port City Signs and Graphics.
Look out your window. If you're seeing a sign,
it could be Port City Signs. It could be Sabrina's work.
If it's a good-looking sign.
Right.
Like that one.
Like a coffee shop.
They did that sign.
They did.
They do all kinds of signs.
So we'll do a lot more.
I think that's part of our job, is to let everyone know that they do so many different products and services. We're going to get to boat wraps. Boat wraps make sense for a fishing podcast. But what we want to do with Sabrina and Port City Signs, right, is tell them so much to offer.
A lot more than vehicle wraps. Anything you need, really.
I already look forward to next episode to see what you're going to feature next episode.
Well, just stay tuned. It's going to be awesome.
I will.
We got another sponsor, which is a familiar partner to the podcast, is Marine Warehouse Center.
Show me.
Terrell and Company. They send a video.
I'm in.
Would you like to watch it?
I would.
Okay, let's do that.
Matt with Marine Warehouse, excited to give you guys a huge update. We're now carrying Seabourn and Spider boat line. Of course, we have the newest models of Carolina Skiff, Sailfish, Sea Chaser, and Pan Marine. With over 60 boats in stock at a Wilmington location, let's schedule a sea trial and let's get you on the water today.
Marine Warehouse Center, Gary. Good people.
They're great people.
You know, they got my boat on the water running.
I don't want to say that was part of the reason we hired you for this gig, but I am aware.
But we finished the boat. They put the engine on it, the steering cable. We took it out same day. Ran great. Still running great today.
Still running great today.
It really is.
They're great. They're great people. I mean, one of my jobs on this podcast is to brand sales, service, and parts. Sales, service, and parts.
It's a good thing to do.
Another unfortunate role of mine is to answer the phone or check my text messages when Terrell, one of the owners, and believe me, as soon as he heard the podcast was returning, he was insatiable. Like, he's been blowing me up. And
he's been staying up night coming up with new material.
Dinner time, breakfast time, middle of work, whatever it is, man. That guy, I don't know what he does at Marine Warehouse Center, but he's got all the time in the world. And here's this wasn't really a joke. He told me about his past. He told him that he used to have a girlfriend. He used to have a girlfriend with a lazy eye. But he had to stop seeing her because she was seeing other people on the side.
Good one. That's what we need.
Terrell's joke.
That's a good one.
Not mine.
It was an acceptable joke. It's a good one.
Well,
I don't know if Terrell.
I hope you like it, because I'm not sure they go up from there.
Well, that one was 100%.
All right.
For me. And as we said before, they are one of our awesome sponsors of the podcast. And if you'd like to get involved in sponsoring the podcast, just contact thefishermanspost.com and we can help you out.
We'd love to have you sponsor the show. Another new announcement. So we have, with the return of the podcast, we're doing something different. We are offering early releases of the podcast. So this podcast will be released publicly on our YouTube channel every other Thursday starting May 9th. But for those that just want to see it earlier, we're doing an early release to our membership, to our member-based, Fisherman's Post community. And that would be our weekly inshore fishing reports and forecasts, where I'm grateful that they've signed up, that they're tuning in to hear weekly reports from up and down the North Carolina coast. I want to give them more value for their dollars, so my membership will be able to access the reports a week earlier than public release. But perhaps even more attractive is we are offering bonus podcast content behind that membership wall to the membership. And that'll be following this podcast, David Harden is going to spark a conversation. He's going to imagine, he's not going to imagine, he's going to ask the questions he would have asked had he been in my chair. So as co-host, he's going to have a 10-minute conversation with our guest each podcast. And that bonus content, again, is for the membership basis. So if you've been thinking about joining the weekly inshore fishing reports and you need an extra push, how about early podcast release and bonus content? There's my big notice.
That sounds great. I'll be ready.
It's like I practiced it.
It is. You've done this before, I can tell.
And I didn't cuss because I didn't mess up.
That's good.
And all the practices.
That's good. Your children will be proud of you.
But one last, I know you guys want me to bring on the guests. One last notice. If you were a fan of the podcast before, you know that we ended every podcast with Billy's best takeaway. Well, now that David is our co-host, I bet you can't guess what we're going to end this podcast with.
It's not going to be David's best takeaway.
David's best takeaway. Yeah.
Unbelievable.
We ran it by a focus group, and that was what rang the best.
The committee was worth it.
But we're also going to ask you, I want to get a feel before this podcast ends. I'm going to ask you, what are your what about questions? As in, I want to know what questions you would have asked, or at least one, or that you would have asked had you been in my chair talking to Pierre or whatever the captain guest is that time.
All right, I'll do it.
All right. But right now, it's my pleasure, again, after 2+ years, to welcome our first guest back to the new version of the Saltwater Podcast series, Captain Pierre Agena, rising sun fishing out of the Wrightsville Beach area. Going to talk about inlet fishing for Spanish mackerel. Welcome to the show, Pierre.
Hey, man. Hey, guys. Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Yeah, man. A treat, man. Love that you signed on. This is your first podcast appearance. We didn't get a chance to have you as a guest before it took its hibernation, but I think you're familiar with the podcast format, and this part hasn't changed. Before we get to the main attraction, I got 2 questions for you. And Pierre, you tell me you're ready for question number 1. I give you question number 1.
Give me question number 1.
Question number 1: why should anyone listen to anything you have to say about a Spanish mackerel?
Fair enough. So I am a full-time fishing guide here in the Wilmington area, all the way from South Topsail down to Carolina Beach. Been fishing this area steadily for 15+ years, and then actually grew up down here, spending my childhood down here on Carolina Beach, Curry Beach. Started out as a pier rat and kind of worked my way up from there, and just have enjoyed the adventure along the way. So full-time fishing guide. Catch a lot of Spanish mackerel, and we've even caught a few together, haven't we, Gary? So it works sometimes.
Yes, we have caught some Spanish mackerel together. I hope we catch some more Spanish mackerel together. And that is an acceptable answer to question number 1. And that moves me to question number 2. You're ready? I ask.
Let's do it.
All right. Question number 2. Based off of this name, Pierre, I'm going to imagine it is something French. So I have a French question for you. From the following list, what item or items are actually French? I'm going to give you 4 items, and you tell me which of these 4 items is actually French.
Okay.
French kissing, French dressing, French toast, French fries.
Yeah, I'm going to go with French. I'm going to go with French kissing, actually. That's just because I'm a lover at heart. So,
It's actually none of the above. This is a trick question. I got you on a trick question.
Okay.
None are French. And as a former teacher, you should have anticipated the old trick question. But enough of that. Let's talk about Spanish. People are already wishing we would stop this and just get on with the main show. So first talking point would be times and tides, but we talked about this pre-show. We're not going to focus on year round. We're more focusing on the spring leading into summer. We're going to leave fall alone and even more that beginning of summer than the end of summer. So what do you got for us? Let's get started with times and tides, inlet fishing for Spanish mackerel.
Yep. So let's just get right into it. Times and tides. As long as the water's moving around those inlets, first and foremost, you should have some success. Now, over time, you'll kind of pick up on some habits and patterns that you'll see. Those fish are going to be a little bit more active at certain tides. Maybe it's the tail end of the falling tide. Maybe it's the first bit of the rising tide, but also where their location is based on the tide. So let's just start with, at a higher tide, a lot of times you'll find those fish pushed in, especially if the tide's still coming in. They'll kind of be pushed into the inlet, and you'll catch them actually inside the inlet. We're going to use Masonboro Inlet as kind of our base example for today. So a lot of times on the high tide, you'll catch them inside the inlet. You'll see them breaking surface, working bait, marking them on your screen, all the above. As that tide falls out, a lot of times you'll see those fish kind of stack up on the edges of that tide line that's kind of forming right there on the edges of the jetty wall, the inlet mouth. It's usually in most cases pretty clear to see that there's a flow of water coming out of that inlet, or if it's an incoming tide coming into that inlet. Those fish will kind of stack up right there along those lines. And, those lines may extend, a couple hundred yards outside of the inlet mouth. So being able to target those fish at a lower tide, at a falling tide, don't be afraid to try further out from the inlet as well. Any questions at this point?
I guess I might ask, it would be, if I'm thinking about times, and I know you were talking about times, so if I'm thinking about times, how does any of what you just told us relate to like early morning, early morning, or day fishing, or sun going down fishing for Spanish mackerel?
Yeah, for sure. So I think early spring, a lot of times those fish aren't really dependent as much on, high sun, heat, things like that. It's still not quite warm enough for them. When I start inlet fishing, usually I'm doing this about the 1st of May into June, all the way through June. You can catch them around the inlets pretty good. As the water warms up, I tend to fish earlier and earlier in the morning. But there is something to be said that when the sun does get high, a lot of times that bait that they're feeding on is a lot more visible. They're able to actually key in on that, and you'll actually see them a lot of times come up when the sun gets high enough. Those fish will actually become a little bit more active on the top. Maybe not so much, in the dead middle of the day when, the sun's beating down. But definitely, that mid-morning bite, a lot of times that sun will kind of help those fish come to the surface where they'll start feeding a little bit more actively near the top. If I'm starting very early in the morning, a lot of times I'm going to start on a troll. I think we'll get into that a little later. But yeah, usually before I see fish surfacing, I'm going to start on the troll first thing in the morning. There's definitely nothing wrong with, being there when the sun's coming up, catching that sunrise and catching a few Spanish as they start to come to the surface.
All right. I have one other question. Now goes back to tides. So do you find any pattern as far as I'll say inside the tide line or outside the tide line? I guess they can be anywhere on any given day, but I'm wondering if you sort of see more pattern on one side or the other.
Honestly, I fish kind of cross the tide line. So I'm imagining in my head a falling tide. So tide's coming out. I'll actually cast up current and into that tide line and bring it back across to the outside of the tide line. If I'm not getting bit there, sometimes I'll ease off a little bit to the outside of the tide line. Sometimes those fish are kind of stacked up on the edges. And kind of, maybe if there's a really strong current flow, they're not, right in that actual tide line there. They might just be, all pushed off to the side. So it varies. I don't have a very specific answer as far as, definitely want to fish inside the tide line. That's not necessarily true. It's more of a trial and error based on the situation that day, for sure.
Okay, man. I don't know if you have something else to add to time and tides. I'm all ears, or maybe this is when you switch to what you start looking for as you approach the inlet.
Yeah, so a lot of these go hand in hand, right? So time, tide, what you're going to use when, it all kind of ties back together. So I'm sure we'll touch again on tide and time as we go through this. But as I was saying, I think the first thing, let's say we're going on a normal day, it's middle of May, those fish are starting to get close to the inlet. The water's, about 68 degrees. That's a pretty good number. And we're getting close to that now, by the way. A little insight for everybody. Things are heating up out front. So I'm going to probably start on the troll, and I'm going to troll a couple of different things. Usually I'm going to start with some kind of spoon, some kind of mackerel tree, something where I'm towing behind the boat, trolling, near the surface, right? Or maybe subsurface. So you're going to use things like a trolling weight, which is just a small inline weight to hold it just, several feet below the surface, or even naked, and just actually let this be like more of like on a surface walker, something that kind of is just drifting behind the boat. In addition to that, on my other rod, I'll usually run usually around the inlets, I'm using a number 1 planer. That's going to get you around 15 to 20 feet deep. That's usually pretty good, especially at the inlet mouth. So you're covering at that point both levels of water. If those fish are actually congregated down deep feeding, you can hit them when you're pulling a planer behind the boat. And simply, a planer is just a device that is used to drive the bait down. So when it rods, you're clipped to this ring here. Okay, and as you're going along, your bait is tied onto this rear eye here, and it's about 30 feet behind the planer. A lot of people will vary as far as how long their leaders are coming off of the planer. I've heard some people say as much as 45 feet. I've personally used down to about 15 feet in some points if the fish are really active. It just makes line management a lot easier. So I do have several different leader spools tied on, ready to go. Just if we're moving very quickly and we're catching a lot of fish, I'll throw the short leader on just so we can flip them in and out really quick. But yeah, definitely going to cover all levels of water as we're first starting out in the morning.
I got a question.
Yes, sir.
Is it is 2 line standard? Do you ever find reason to pull a 3rd line, or would you recommend? And again, this is mostly a rec fishing crowd that's watching the podcast, and like
Sure.
2 lines very manageable. But is there ever a reason to like run something far, or just add a 3rd complement?
My recommendation to everybody is to keep it simple, right? We tend to overcomplicate fishing a lot. Even myself, when there's a tough bite, you'll start to think about 1,000 different reasons of why something's not going the way you want it to. So my philosophy is to keep it simple. Instead of running multiple lines, 3, 4 lines, 5 lines, run 2, but don't be afraid to switch baits and have those pre-rigged and tied up on the boat, where you can just bring in your trolling rods and then switch out on a swivel very quickly. 2 lines is very manageable. Just when you're trolling, speeds are very important. Obviously navigating around other boats and the inlet is very important. When we're talking about speed, you definitely want to be somewhere for Spanish mackerel in that 7 to 8 mile range, mile an hour range. If you're picking up lizard fish on your planer rod, you're probably too close to the bottom. Maybe you're going too slow. If you're picking up bluefish, maybe try going just a hair faster, like a half a mile an hour faster, and see if the Spanish actually start biting. So my magic number is right around 7, up to 7.5, 8 miles an hour, which seems pretty quick to some people, but I can assure you the Spanish are moving very fast as well.
And so I'm guessing the length varies, so that your planer rod's going to be the shorter, closer to the boat, and then whatever you're doing surface or subsurface is back further?
That's exactly right, Gary. Yeah. So that planer rod, maybe 20 feet, 25, 30 feet behind the boat is all you really need. Let that kind of dig down get down to the bottom there. And then your other line, definitely have it out a little further, 45, 50 feet behind the boat is usually pretty good. From there, watch your turns, take your turns a little wider. Remember that just because that planer's down and your main line is down, fairly close to the boat, you still have 45 feet of leader behind that planer. So definitely take your turns wide, don't cut it too sharply, And just again, I stress to keep it very simple. 2 rods is plenty. If you get into a mackerel bite, it tends to be very fast action as it is. Keeping 2 rods going usually isn't too hard to do. So that would definitely be my recommendation.
All right. Now my next question, and I'm guessing this is absolutely related to what to look for. So I know you believe in inlet fishing. I mean, I've experienced inlet fishing with you. And so I guess, are you going out? Have you committed to inlet fishing no matter what you see, or do you need to see something to commit to inlet fishing, or you start to scratch your head and think about going further out?
Yeah, for sure. So definitely, what the advantage of inlet fishing is usually you can kind of base it off a time of year, right? So May, June is a great time to do it. There's a minor period in the fall where you can do it that coincides with the mullet run. That's probably around September, October, some into November a little bit. But definitely coincides with, times of the year. But in addition to that, there's some things that you definitely want to see when you're riding around that inlet. You definitely want to see birds working. You definitely want to see some bait, whether it's glass minnows, sardines, anchovies, and actually once you do hook a fish, don't be afraid to do your research. What is that fish eating? What has it digested? If they are, spitting up all those little tiny glass minnows, that barf bait that we call, you may want to use a smaller presentation. If they're keyed in on, bay anchovies, which are, 3 and 4 inches, don't be afraid to use a bigger spoon. We call that matching the hatch. It's pretty standard practice in all of fishing, but, that applies to whether you're trolling, whether you're casting. You want your presentation to kind of match, what those fish are eating. So you're looking for bait. You're looking for that tide line coming out of the inlet. Cloud cover, is it cloudy? If it's cloudy, I'm definitely probably going to start on the troll immediately and stay in the troll until I see a little bit of sun. Sometimes those fish will still come up no matter what, but definitely sunlight definitely helps. Other things I'm looking for, if I'm not seeing those directly in the inlet, don't be afraid to look a little north, a little south of the inlet. A lot of times you'll find bait balls. Those are usually menhaden, sometimes threadfin herring are kind of grouped up tightly together. But around those bait balls, a lot of times those Spanish mackerel will be feeding, just on the edges of those bait balls too. So definitely another area you can target those fish, whether you're casting or trolling, is those bait balls that tend to congregate around those inlets as well.
All right. Next question. I've already asked you this question in a previous circumstance. I know the answer, and I enjoyed your answer, so I'm going to set you up for it again. Hey man, when people are talking about looking for birds, are there particular birds that get you more excited than other birds? And I know how you're going to answer this, and I like your answer because I don't know birds that well, even though I've grown up on the water. So what's the answer, Pierre?
It's Gary. I'm right there with you, man. I'm out there every day, and to me, a bird is almost always a bird. So my simple answer to you is I prefer the small birds. When I say small birds, I'm usually referring to, your gulls. They're usually the ones kind of hovering over the bait. If you're seeing pelicans, your bigger birds, your ospreys, they're probably keyed in on either menhaden, mullet, something a little bit bigger. But a lot of times the dead giveaway for mackerel fishing are the small birds kind of just pecking and just slightly hovering over the surface. That is just a pure dead giveaway to their, if it's not Spanish mackerel, there's definitely bluefish underneath them. So there's something fun to be had around those small birds working. So simple answer is small birds, Gary. Nothing fancy about that. Just nice and easy. We're going to go with small birds working.
And small birds for the win. That I go with that. So one more question, and because you said earlier something about seeing Spanish on your machine. I have a machine. Most people have a machine. Most people don't know how to use the machine or use the machine well. I mean, are you just seeing something on the machine? Or are you seeing something that gives you confidence that these are in fact Spanish mackerel?
The machine thing, it takes some time. It's definitely something that it helps when you're out there every single day doing it and using it, and you have time to kind of play with it. It is a toy. There's no doubt about it. So just spending time with your machine will definitely help. But the easiest way to actually use your machine effectively for inlet fishing for mackerel go mark those bait balls. If they're not visible from the surface, there are a lot of times you will be able to mark bait balls on your machine. And that's just going to be a mid-water column cluster, usually dark red, of something, right? You're like, ooh, you drive over it and you're like, ooh, that's something, right? And it might be 3 million pinfish. It might be a cluster of menhaden, but it is a bait ball, right? So you're going to want to, you can mark that on your screen, and you can actually troll around that, use that as a waypoint, as an opportunity to look for Spanish mackerel. On the machine, marking Spanish mackerel, I know for myself, I use Simrad. You can actually kind of tell if you spend enough time with it, what a cluster of Spanish mackerel look like versus, whether it's gray trout on the bottom. Even, sometimes you can even tell them apart from the bluefish. The bluefish kind of cloud up your screen a good bit, but those mackerel tend to have a lot of individual arches. And if you're seeing a bait ball with some individual arches around it, it's definitely an area that you should be targeting. So spend time with your machine. YouTube is a great resource. Honestly, you could probably do a whole podcast on machinery. I wouldn't be your guy, but I'm sure there's somebody here who knows, a lot more about, sonar and things like that compared to myself. But there are ways to use it around the inlet for sure.
I think at this point, you showed us a spoon. You showed us the, your basic planer. We have in there on our show notes lure and tackle choices. So this might be a good time to transition into what else is on Pierre's boat when he goes out for a day of inlet fishing for Spanish mackerel.
Yeah. So our favorite way to do it, my favorite way to do it, is absolutely to cast for him, or vertical jig. When I say vertical jig, just working up and down vertically from the boat. Very simple. You can do that along the edges of the jetty wall, the inlet, free floating that tide line and kind of drifting out with the tide. Sometimes we'll jig that if we have enough room to operate that. But yeah, so very simple. A lot of times I'll start with some sort of casting metal. Most of the times they come with treble hooks on the back there. I will switch to inline singles a lot of times, just especially if the bite is really good. These treble hooks make a lot of mess with the fish on the boat. But yeah, definitely a casting metal. This can also be used just as effectively straight up and down jigging as well. Pretty standard metal. I use 3/4 ounce. That's kind of my go-to. Just make sure it matches the weight of your rod. And again, match the hatch, right? So I try to find a lot of times a very skinny, narrow profile. There are some other profiles that are a little bit fatter, some that are a little bit longer. All, just different varieties of baits that could be used to kind of get closer and closer to that hatch of what they're eating on. If I'm having a tough bite, sometimes I'll use the First Flight lures, the hex head jigs. Simply enough, if you're familiar with a gotcha plug, if you're a pier guy, or if you've ever been a pier guy, you know about the gotcha plug for mackerel. But that hex head jig simply gives you a lot more action in the water. It kind of has more of a darting movement to it. Definitely will trigger a bite, a lot more effectively than sometimes just fast reeling those metal jigs. And it all depends on what you're doing. If you're having fish up top busting and breaking surface, whip out those casting metals, cast over the school, and just work it back almost as fast as you possibly can. You should pick up a bite pretty quickly.
Well, that I was going to ask that question. If we are fortunate enough to see surface activity, like what would be my instruction on your boat? Would it be to throw right in them? Would it be throw over them and pull them through them? Would it be try to get in front of them and have them move into it?
For sure.
What's the ideal scenario, and what's the scenario perhaps you don't want?
Yeah. So ideal scenario, you kind of ease your way into that. Let's say you got fish breaking surface. They're congregating at the mouth of the inlet. You want to ease over to those fish. You don't want to run over there, throw a boat wake. That tends to kind of push those fish back down. You want to kind of just ease over, and your best bet is to always try to cast over the school of where you imagine that school is being, right? So if you're seeing a lot of fish breaking in one area, can you cast 5, 10, 15, 20 yards over them so you can start your retrieve, right? That does two things. Number one, it doesn't spook the fish out. Number two, it allows your bait to have time to kind of speed up and have a lot more, call it a running head start, if you will, of your bait working through that school when you're coming back, right? So you land this jig on the other side of the school, it's fluttering down, you tighten up your line, then you start to reel, right? It has an opportunity to come through that school looking just like a bait fish would. So the ideal situation, you ease up to them, cast over them. And in most cases, I just tell my clients, let it, count to 2, close your bail, and just reel as fast as you can, right? Most cases, you don't need a lot of jigging action. You don't need a lot of, motion with the rod. Just keep a nice low rod tip and burn it back is what we call it, right? Just reel as fast as possible.
All right, man. Sometimes, and I think of this more, I guess this is a more popular conversation with bonito fishing, like to run and gun or not to run and gun. And where are we on inlet fishing for Spanish mackerel, man? Where are you on the run and gun or not to run and gun?
That's tough, man. Because if you're running and gunning around the inlet, you're seeing fish surface here. You're seeing fish surface, 300 yards away. You can have some effectiveness with that. Being quick from one school to the other, or they're hopping here, they're hopping there. You can definitely, if you get to them quickly, make a couple casts on them, you can pick up a few fish. In the grand scheme of things, if you are finding areas where you're seeing the bait and you're seeing the birds working, but those fish aren't actively surfaced right there at that time, if you give it a couple minutes, a lot of times those fish will pop back up. So many times I've pulled trolling motor or said, burning your lines, but they're breaking over here. We pick up, we run, we get to the other side of the wall, and they go back down, and we look and turn our heads where we were, and they're going ballistic, right? So there's certain situations you do want to bounce and run and gun, but for the most part, if you're set up in the right area and you're using, that inlet is an ambush point. Stick to the ambush point, trust the plan. Those fish are going to be in that area at one point or another. You're best off, at least maybe not going out there with the intention of running and gunning, but just kind of, using the ambush point to your benefit.
All right. I think my next question focuses on the transition from trolling to casting. And so your theory or your philosophy, not theory, philosophy. So are you going to the cast? Basically, do you need to see fish to go to the cast? Do you need to see that surface activity? Or will you go to the cast with less than seeing surface activity? Like if you're picking up some fish on the troll, does that give you enough confidence? Does it come from the machine? Or really we need to see some activity to truly get excited and abandon the troll for the cast?
Two schools of thought there. Number one, if you're seeing other things that are indicators of fish, right? So if I don't see actual Spanish mackerel or bluefish or something breaking surface, but I see a bait ball, I'm going to work the edges of the bait ball. Cast to the edge of the bait ball. Maybe let your bait flutter down 3, 4, 5 seconds, then close your bail and start your retrieve. Maybe get close to that bait ball and vertically jig on it, right? But yeah, as far as switching over, there's going to be some kind of key indicator, right? Usually it's when the fish surface. That's my dead giveaway for sure. But also in the Masonboro area, I'll actually jig vertically along the tide line. So if we're not picking them up quickly on the troll, if we're scratching out a few fish, but we're marking a lot of bait in one area, we may actually drop down and fish vertically, in that area, something that we've marked on the screen. So no, it's not always, just when they surface. That is the easiest giveaway, but a lot of times there's some other key indicator. It's the birds, maybe they're not breaking surface as far as the fish, but the birds are, pecking at the water. They're picking up little glass minnows. That's usually enough for me to at least say, okay, let's make a couple casts here. For sure. But yeah, definitely some kind of key indicator that's going to make me switch over from trolling. Trolling is the old school standard practice. It's tried and true, but casting's a lot more fun. Jigging's a lot more fun. So if I do see some of those indicators and I'm ready to switch over, usually we'll switch over pretty quickly.
So you have my attention on jigging. And so I guess I guess my question is, like, are you just bouncing it off the bottom? I mean, there's only but so much depth if you're in 20 to 40 feet of water. Like if you're bringing it up, it's going to come up pretty quick. Do you have some other technique to keep the lure in a strike zone longer? Or bouncing off the bottom is like a lizard fish risk. I guess I just want to understand vertical jigging when we're 20 to 40 feet.
Yeah, so it's just, it's scaled down is what it is. When I say vertical jigging, basically what I'll do is I'll have people start by dropping it all the way to the bottom, and I'll have them, pop with their rod, try to imagine them, raising their rod tip up about 1 to 2 feet, on average per pop. So I'll have them start on the bottom. Obviously, you're going to pick up some lizard fish. You're going to pick up some bluefish. If I'm seeing indicators in the mid-water column, what I'll have them do is I'll actually have them drop their rod tip back down, let them, touch the bottom, have them reel up, to whatever depth I think they should be at, right? So, if it's 20 feet, I'll say, okay, give me 3 turns. I know you're up about 8 more feet from there. So you're somewhere in the mid-water column. So now you're dropping that rod up and down 1 to 2 feet. You're working, from 12 to 8 feet roughly. So, it's just a matter of scaling, where you want your baits to be in the water column. It's not what am I trying to say here? It's not necessarily the action of jigging itself. It's a lot of times it's the falling action. Those Spanish mackerel are keyed in on a lot of baits that are falling, especially if you're fishing around, bait balls and things like that. They'll key in on scraps like that. So a lot of times you get bit when that bait is falling. So, just keep that in mind. Try to keep tension on your line as you go down, because if you lose tension as you're dropping your jig back down on the fall, that's a lot of times when you get bit off and tend to lose a lot of lures like that.
All right, now my question, and we're going to stay on the jigging, or maybe this is more like the casting question. Are you always adrift, or do you find reason to, say, use the trolling motor to spot lock an area?
Yeah. So, if you are in an area where you are set up and you can put down your trolling motor and you can cast either breaking fish, or you're on, the part of the jetty wall that you are seeing some action just outside the jetty, don't be afraid to hit your trolling motor, or don't be afraid to put out anchor. Anchor's kind of tough because, again, situation does change. Sometimes those fish will surface outside the inlet, and that's when you're going to want to run and gun. Traditional anchor makes that a little tough. Trolling motor helps, but again, still not as quick. I tend to put my boat in neutral a lot, especially if I'm working outside of the inlet, right? So just, maybe 100 yards north, 100 yards south, or, 100 yards out of the inlet. A lot of times I'll just put the boat in neutral. We'll fish up on a school of fish that are breaking surface, or we'll jig, around a bait ball. Because remember, right, if you put your boat in neutral, that boat's going to drift with the current. A lot of times your bait is being pushed by that same current too. So a lot of times you can stay pretty close to that bait ball as you're drifting as well. Or if you're working a tide line, a lot of times you can stay pretty close to that tide line as you're kind of jigging and working your way out of there as well. So, the neutral technique I really like, just because I can kind of pick up and move quickly. I can make adjustments on the fly. It's kind of nice. It does help that I'm driving the boat versus trying to fish and drive. So, fishing and driving, that's a whole different ball game. Especially on a busy day around the inlets.
Man, we're pretty much at the end of our time here, but I know that as a former teacher, you came very prepared for this podcast appearance. Is there any talking points that I didn't set you up with a question, or anything you would wish you said before, or maybe just like a final thought?
Nothing crazy. My recommendation would be to, just go out and enjoy it, right? Nobody has success on the water every single day, but there are a ton of resources and opportunities for you to study, and to kind of get engaged with this whole idea of fishing. If you're new to the game, Fisherman's Post was something that I looked at as a kid, growing up, and it's a great resource. And now they have a podcast. Now they have weekly reports, which are really good, by the way. So there's a lot of great opportunities for, staying engaged with the, current information and learning a new skill or technique, or maybe something that you've never even heard of, out there now. So there's a lot of opportunities, but the only opportunity that really, trumps everything is time on the water, right? So, getting knowledge from a local fishing guide is always, a great opportunity. I'd love to share that opportunity with you guys. But for the most part, time on the water, going out and enjoying it and doing it and trying it is trial and error is the best way to do this.
I know you were basically complimenting Fisherman's Post, but all my brain heard is, as a kid reading the paper, it was you like passive aggressively trying to make me feel old. That's what I took away from it.
Yeah, man. I used to be young, dumb, and handsome, and there was this old grizzled, gray-haired guy that I would always read the tide line report from. So, it kept, that was my reading material on the beach when I was a kid, man.
I don't know if it was Fisherman's Post that turned me gray, or more likely wife and kids that turned me gray. But Pierre, you've been a great guest, man. A great reintroduction to the Saltwater Podcast series. So glad we connected. So glad you had time to spend with us tonight.
It's always good seeing you guys, David. Thanks for being here, man, and look forward to doing this sometime soon.
Yeah, my pleasure.
All right, Pierre.
All right.
That was great. I'm ready to go.
I can tell you're ready to go.
I'm ready to go. I'm going to hook my boat up tomorrow. I'm going to head out.
Yeah, this is David Harden, very excited.
This is it. I'm ready. I'm ready.
Well, I hope you're ready right now, because as advertised, you have to share with me David's best takeaway. And let me say, I'm going to augment that and say David's singular best takeaway.
Okay, so I can only pick one thing.
You can pick two if you really want to.
Okay, all right. Well, these are, when you go out and do Spanish fishing, there's so much to think about. But what Pierre said about keeping it simple, I think is something that can save you. It's a good practice for fishing. Just use your two lines. You got one high, you got one low, and you stick with it, and you're going to be successful doing that. So. Mm-hmm. And then your line, you're less likely to get your lines tangled up in a big mess, and you're spending all your day untangling lines rather than fishing.
You might want to start with one line.
So yeah, maybe. I'll do it. One line. That's all you need. Just catch one at a time.
Baby steps.
That's it. That's all I need.
All right. Well, how about this? How about what about question? What would you have asked had you been sitting in my chair? What did I miss?
Okay, so touched on this a little bit. But when you talk about morning and afternoon and evening, I've always heard you go out, crack of dawn. It's like you got to go out first thing in the morning for Spanish mackerel. It's like, can you catch them in the evening? Is that a good time to go, or are you wasting your time?
You mean nighttime, dark time?
Not dark time, but like before it gets dark, like in the evening, like after work.
All right. Okay. Well, there we go. That's what David Harden would have asked had he been sitting in my chair. Hey, we want to thank you guys.
We do. We have two sponsors. We want to thank, again, Port City Signs and Graphics, and also Marine Warehouse Center for sponsoring the show. If you are interested in sponsoring the show, please contact the Fisherman's Post, and we can help you out.
And it feels so good to be back doing the podcast. Thank you guys for all your questions and pushing us to bring it back. It did make a difference. We did hear you, and it feels good to be back in the podcast chair.